Hi everyone, this is Kim Velasquez, and as we're moving into organismal biology, there are some basic biological terms that are important to review. So some of you might be learning these terms for the first time, and others of you have learned them throughout the semester, probably at the very beginning of the semester, and it's important to review those terms before moving into organismal biology. I'm calling it organismal biology because if you're taking the general biology course, you are moving into discussing all types of living organisms. If you are in Biology 102, then you are mostly just looking at those organisms that are human pathogens. But either way, these terms are very important to your understanding. So the first thing to recall is the difference between a unicellular and a multicellular organism. So unicellular, as the term really specifies, is a one-celled organism, meaning the entire organism is made of just one cell. And all the functions are carried out by that one single cell. They can only get to a certain size, and they usually have a short lifespan and no real specialization of different types of cells because there's only one cell, so they can't really specialize. They tend to be microscopic, meaning you can't see them with the naked eye because they can't get big enough to be seen with the naked eye. Comparing that with a multicellular organism, meaning that entire organism is made of more than one cell, and those cells are usually specialized into different functions, even with tissue layers and cells that are performing very specific functions for that organism. They tend to be much larger, obviously, because they're made of more than one cell. They tend to be macroscopic, meaning you can see them with the naked eye, and they definitely have a longer lifespan in general than the one-celled organisms. Okay, so examples of unicellular organisms, obviously all bacteria are unicellular. All protists are unicellular. The difference is, of course, that bacteria are prokaryotic cells, while protists are single-celled eukaryotes. So that means protists have a nucleus, they have membrane-bound organelles, they are far more complex in structure than the prokaryotic cells. Okay, then some algae are single-celled, and then we have some fungi that are single-celled. Mostly it's just the yeast. The yeast are the single-celled fungi. And those are in the category of human pathogen. Obviously, multicellular organisms far more complex, so it would include animals, plants, and most fungi. Most fungi are multicellular. By the way, fungi is also correctly pronounced fungi, also fungi and fungi. So 4 different pronunciations of that term. Reproduction in organisms can either be sexual or asexual. And this is going to be important as we start talking about organismal diversity, and also as we talk about different human pathogens. The mode of reproduction is important to understand. If an organism has asexual reproduction, it really means it just makes a copy of itself. There is no joining of gametes to produce a zygote that then develops into the mature organism. So yeast budding, they are really just replicating their genome and then making an identical copy of themselves. This is a protist, again, replicating its genome and then just splitting in two to make an identical copy of itself. So that's asexual reproduction. Compared with sexual reproduction, where egg and sperm come together, so there's a fertilization event that produces that very first cell, the zygote. So recall that both of these gametes, the egg and sperm, have the haploid number of chromosomes, while the zygote has the diploid number of chromosomes. And then that divides and divides, and the cells specialize and eventually make the entire mature organism. So that's sexual reproduction. I know none of these terms are really connected at this point, but you will be using all of these terms to understand the organismal biology that's coming up. So it's kind of a biological vocabulary review. Okay, an autotroph versus a heterotroph. An autotroph is an organism that makes its own food, and we usually call those autotrophs producers because they're producing food. So these would be plants and algae that carry out photosynthesis and they make carbohydrates for the rest of the food chain. Versus a heterotroph who has to eat an autotroph or someone who ate an autotroph. So those are the consumers. They get their energy by eating other organisms. They cannot produce their own energy. And it's all animals, most bacteria and fungi are what are called heterotrophs. So two different kinds of autotrophs. Photoautotrophs are what we're mostly familiar with. So they get their energy from the sun and they carry out photosynthesis to make chemical energy in their cells. And they're not being altruistic. They're not doing it for the benefit of the rest of the food chain. It just happens to turn out that way. They're actually making it for themselves. So they also have to carry out cell respiration, as all living organisms do. They just don't eat. Instead, they make their own carbohydrates and then use those carbohydrates to carry out cellular respiration. Chemoautotrophs actually get energy by some other mechanism. So they're getting it from chemicals. So rather than using light energy, they're using chemical energy. And that's something we don't really talk about in this class, but you will hear this term sometimes with reference to certain organisms. Okay, so when we're looking at heterotrophs, there are a lot of different levels of heterotrophs depending on where these organisms are in the food chain. So herbivores would be what we call primary consumers. So they're all consumers, but depending on where they are on the food chain, herbivores would be kind of the lowest level. They eat plants. And then carnivores eat animals who either ate a plant or ate another animal. If you're an omnivore, you eat plants and animals. If you're a detritivore, you feed on dead material. And if you're a decomposer, such as bacteria and fungi, you break down organic matter. The difference is that you don't actually eat it if you're a decomposer. So a decomposer would secrete some type of chemical to cause digestion of that material. And in fact, fungi actually digest outside of their cells and then absorb those nutrients into their cells. So extracellular digestion is a characteristic of fungi. Okay, it's important to understand different species interactions, especially when we start talking about human pathogens. So we're going to talk about different levels of symbiotic relationships in biological organisms. So symbiosis means living together. So bio is living and sim means together. It's an arrangement between organisms of different species. So if two organisms of the same species are living together, that is not considered symbiosis. Symbiosis is when organisms of different species are living together in a close arrangement of some sort. Now, those don't always benefit both organisms. So we're going to look at the different categories of those symbiotic relationships. And we're going to use a plus, a minus, and a zero to determine whether one of the organisms is benefited, one is harmed, or there's no effect. So 5 major categories of symbiotic relationship: predation, parasitism, competition, mutualism, and commensalism. And so there's a picture of each of those here. Sorry, I'm laughing because I took this slide from the internet and some of these pictures just are kind of a funny example. This one, not funny. Okay, so that's predation. In this picture, it appears that that seal is about to eat that penguin. Not a happy turnout for the penguin. Parasitism, this ugly little tick here that's about to suck the blood of some organism. Competition, these two Cape buffalo fighting it out, probably for a mate. And this would be called intraspecific competition because they're actually two of the same species. So here I've just told you that symbiosis is between organisms of different species. But a lot of competition in nature is between different species. So different species of organism competing for the same resources. Mutualism is a relationship that benefits both organisms. And then finally, commensalism benefits one and the other is unaffected. So we're going to talk about these in more detail. So predation, that would be a plus-minus relationship. one of the organisms benefits, so that's the plus, and one is harmed. In fact, in predation, the entire organism that is being harmed is eaten. This minus that organism doesn't live. Okay, so it 100% benefits the predator, and it's at the expense of the prey. The prey are consumed, and really predators and prey have closely co-evolved because predators have to develop adaptations for catching their prey, and prey have to have adaptations for escaping or hiding from predators. So very closely related in terms of their adaptations, very closely related in terms of population abundance. And that's something that's closely studied in community ecology and population ecology. Okay, so parasitism is a plus-minus relationship also, but in the case of parasitism, a good parasite does not want to kill its host because you can't just run down the savanna and find another organism to feed from. So if you're a parasite, you're living either on the outside of the host or the inside of the host. Okay, so an ectoparasite lives on the outside, such as a tick or a flea. An endoparasite lives inside the host, such as a parasitic worm, a protist, a bacteria, although we do have bacteria on the outside of our bodies too, but most of those are symbiotic in a good way. But a good parasite doesn't intend to kill their host. They sometimes accidentally kill their host by really compromising the system of that host so much that the host dies. But a good parasite doesn't want to kill their host. It's too hard to find another home. So if the host dies, the parasite usually dies also. Parasites have evolved amazing strategies for survival, lots of specializations, and a lot of them have really complex life cycles involving more than one host that we're going to talk about. So this is an example of some specializations in a parasitic worm. So this is a tapeworm, and this is the region of the tapeworm called the scolex. And you can see these hooks for attaching to the intestines, suckers for attaching to the intestines. They are colorless for the most part. They don't have pigment because no need for pigmentation if you're inside an intestine. They don't have eyes because you don't need to see in an intestine. So these guys are very specialized for attaching and feeding in a host. Some other important terms related to parasitism: a vector. This is a very important term in looking at pathogens of humans. A vector is the organism that transmits the pathogen but doesn't cause the disease itself. Okay, so a mosquito is the vector of the malaria parasite, meaning the mosquito is what transmits the parasite to humans, but it's not really the mosquito that's causing the disease, it's the malarial parasite that's causing the disease. So that's what a vector is. An intermediate host is an organism that harbors the sexually immature form of the parasite, sometimes called the larvae. So the intermediate host is where that organism lives and then eventually gets transmitted to the definitive host, and that's the host in which the sexual reproduction of that parasite will occur. And most often that reproduction of that parasite will then lead to the definitive host transmitting that back to the environment where the intermediate host can pick it up again. So lots of terms related to parasitism. And you'll get more of this information as you go through the organismal diversity. Okay, competition. Some biologists would disagree with this, but a lot of ecologists say that competition is a negative, because in the absence of competition, it's often thought that one or both of those species would be more successful than they are in the presence of competition. And again, in symbiotic relationships, since we're usually talking about species that are different, so two different species, then this occurs when two species are trying to use the same resource. So shelter, food, water, soil nutrients. So that's called interspecific competition, meaning between two different species. Inter means across. And really, one of the biggest principles in ecology is this principle of competitive exclusion, saying that if two species are competing for a resource and that resource is limited, meaning there's not an infinite amount of that resource, then over time, one species will use that resource more efficiently and eventually will eliminate the other in that location. Commensalism is interesting. So commensalism is a +0 because one organism is benefiting from the other, okay, but the other species is not being affected either positively or negatively. And some biologists also have a problem with this because they say that it's impossible to not have some effect on the other organism. But this is an example. This moss is called an epiphyte. It's hanging from this tree, but it's not robbing this tree of nutrients or having any other noticeable adverse effect on the tree. So the moss is benefiting and the tree is essentially not benefited or harmed. So that would be the 0. Mutualism is the one that we've heard the most about. Probably when we think about symbiosis, we think of a ++, where both species benefit. So this is the classic example of the clownfish living in the anemone. The anemone stings other organisms, but these clownfish have developed a mechanism for not being stung by the anemone, and I won't go into detail about that. And there are a lot of theories on what the mutualistic benefit for both organisms really is. You know, it could range from shelter to these clownfish are protecting this anemone from other predators that would kill it. So this anemone is actually an animal, it's not a plant. There are a lot of theories about how these two benefit. You know, maybe it's that the fish can eat the leftover scraps that the anemone spits out after it's finished eating. But either way, they both benefit from this relationship. One of the most interesting relationships, I think, that's mutualistic is that between the pollinator and the plant that it pollinates, because this hummingbird has a very close relationship with this plant, so close that its beak length is exactly that necessary to get the nectar from this flower. And then it will visit another one of these flowers and, without knowing it, transfer pollen from this flower on this plant to the same species of plant in another location, thereby carrying out pollination for that plant. Cross-pollination is a very important thing for genetic diversity in this plant. It's a really beneficial relationship for both organisms because this hummingbird knows that it can go find food at this plant. It has reduced competition for this resource if its beak is specialized to this plant and other hummingbirds don't have a beak that perfectly fits. So now this species of hummingbird can really have this tight relationship with this plant. Also, since it's only going to visit this particular plant species, this plant ensures that its pollen is not going to be wasted on a different plant species, that it will get delivered to another plant of the exact same species. And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of these very tight-knit relationships between a plant and its pollinators. And you can see this little guy with the pollen on his beak. It's a fantastic photo. Okay, again, some unrelated terms, but these are all important. So just reminding you the difference between aerobic and anaerobic. So aerobic means with oxygen and anaerobic means without oxygen. So this could be talking about modes of cell respiration, or it could be talking about the lifestyle of that organism. Related to that, if you have an obligate lifestyle, it means you must do that. Whereas if you're considered facultative, it means you can do that. And there are a lot of different applications of these terms. Okay, so for example, obligate parasites are obligated to that lifestyle. They must live inside a host or they will die. Versus facultative parasites can live inside a host or they can be free living. It also can relate back to those terms aerobic and anaerobic. And especially when you're talking about bacteria, there are facultative anaerobes. So remember, facultative means can and obligate means must. So if you're facultative, that means you can be this, so you can survive in the absence of oxygen, but you can also survive in the presence of oxygen. You can really be somewhat successful in either environment. Versus obligate, if you're an obligate aerobe, it means you must have oxygen, you will die if you don't. And if you're an obligate anaerobe, you must have a condition with no oxygen. In fact, you're killed by oxygen. So these terms are important when talking about bacteria in particular. Okay, and then what is a pathogen? A pathogen is a living organism or a non-living entity. So viruses and prions are examples of non-living entities, but it's called a pathogen if it's capable of causing disease. So any organism or virus or prion, so these would be the non-living, capable of causing disease is what we call a pathogen. And then not all organisms that are in the pathogen category always cause disease. So if you're a true pathogen, sometimes also called a strict pathogen, it means you always cause disease, even in healthy individuals. And you're very associated with a specific and recognizable disease. So if you're a bacteria that causes a specific disease, such as tuberculosis, and every individual who is infected with that bacteria is going to get the disease, then you are a true or strict pathogen. But some pathogens only cause disease in an individual that is immunocompromised or has some other illness that has made them prone to other pathogens. And those are called opportunistic. So those organisms gain access usually due to some type of injury, or the person is immunocompromised. And now this pathogen that wouldn't otherwise harm them becomes harmful because it has the opportunity to do so. Okay, that is a repeat of the same slide. I'm not sure why I did that. Okay, that's it. Those are the terms you need to know to move on to either just organismal diversity or, in the case of Bio 102, human pathogens. Thanks.